In April 1975, the streets of Phnom Penh filled with relief. The war in neighboring Vietnam had just ended, and Cambodians hoped their suffering would end too. When the Khmer Rouge finally entered the capital, they wore sandals and black uniforms waving red flags. Children offered them flowers. Women smiled. There was no gunfire, no destruction. Just a quiet takeover. They told the people, the Americans would bomb the city. Everyone must evacuate, just for a few days. Bring only what you need. Leave everything else behind. Hospitals emptied. Schools shut down. Families pushed old relatives in wheelbarrows, carried children in rice sacks, and shuffled down streets that had just seen peace. The sick were promised care elsewhere. Doctors stayed behind, only to be executed hours later. What no one knew was that this was the beginning of Year Zero. The start of a new world, Pol Pot's world, where money, religion, and identity no longer existed. This wasn't a coup. It was erasure. The Khmer Rouge didn't just want power. They wanted the past to vanish. To reset an entire civilization by wiping the slate clean, with blood. In the days that followed, Phnom Penh became a ghost city. The few left behind were prisoners, forced to sweep streets already swept, paint walls no one would ever see. In the countryside, soldiers turned boys with rifles watched the lines of people stretch to the horizon. Anyone who stopped walking was shot. Babies who cried too loud disappeared. The regime had no use for the old Cambodia. No tolerance for those who remembered it. And no mercy for those who didn't understand fast enough. Cambodia didn't fall in fire. It was smothered in silence. The people didn't know they were being marched into death camps. They didn't know that nearly 2 million of them, 1 in every 4, would never return. The Khmer Rouge told them they were being liberated. But it wasn't liberation. It was the beginning of one of the most brutal genocides of the 20th century. And it all started with a smile. The Khmer Rouge had a dream, a country with no cities, no schools, no currency, no past. They called it Year Zero. A total reset of Cambodian society. Everything that came before, art, language, culture, identity, was an infection to be purged. And so, Cambodia became a graveyard pretending to be a farm. The cities were emptied. Everyone, rich or poor, young or old, was now a base person, forced to live in jungle collectives and obey the revolution. Doctors became laborers. Teachers became rice farmers. Children were separated from their parents and raised by the regime. Wearing glasses became a death sentence. Reading books? Treason. Speaking French? You were a colonial poison. The Khmer Rouge didn't just kill people. They killed ideas. Everything was suspicion. Everyone was watched. At night, the jungle echoed with screams. People vanished. Their names were erased. Their stories untold. And those who survived had to become ghosts themselves. The worst enforcers weren't battle-hardened men. They were boys, 13, sometimes younger, armed with guns, knives, and blind loyalty. They were the perfect soldiers, easily manipulated, utterly merciless, and told that anyone over 30 was the enemy. Some of them killed their own parents. Entire villages were turned against themselves. To resist was death. To speak was death. Even to remember your real name was dangerous. People stopped talking. Families avoided eye contact. Food became punishment, doled out in palmfuls of rice gruel. Starvation wasn't a byproduct. It was policy. The Khmer Rouge believed that suffering revealed the true believer. That hunger, silence, and fear would cleanse the soul. And as people grew thinner and quieter, the regime grew more powerful. Those who had once studied in Paris, who had read Marx and Lenin and dreamed of equality, now presided over a country of bones. They called it justice. But it wasn't justice. It was annihilation wrapped in ideology. Year Zero wasn't the start of a new world. It was the end of a nation's memory. Dr. Hang S. Inger had once delivered life into the world. He was an obstetrician in Phnom Penh, respected, educated, proud. But when the Khmer Rouge came, none of that mattered. Wearing glasses marked you for death. Speaking French meant you were a traitor. Being a doctor was a curse. So he became someone else. He destroyed his medical papers. Hid his wedding ring. Pretended to be a cab driver. Pretended not to understand. Pretended not to care. And it worked, for a while. He was sent to a labor camp with his wife, pregnant and fragile. They worked from dawn until nightfall, eating insects and chewing bark to survive. One day she went into early labor. Bleeding. Crying. Dying. And Hang Inger, the man who had delivered hundreds of children, had to stand there. Motionless. If he helped, he'd be exposed. If he admitted he was a doctor, they'd both be killed. So he watched his wife, and their unborn child, die in agony. He never forgave himself. This wasn't a tragedy. This was policy. The Khmer Rouge believed suffering was cleansing. Mercy was betrayal. If someone slowed down, they were lazy. If they cried, they were weak. Those who wept for their loved ones were dragged away at night. Those who remained learned not to cry. The labor camps weren't just about work. They were about unmaking the self. People slept shoulder to shoulder in filthy huts. No privacy. No names. No prayers. No past. Even helping the sick became dangerous. Someone might accuse you of practicing medicine, a capitalist crime. And so people watched each other die. In silence. What kind of world is that, where the most moral thing you can do is nothing? Where love becomes a liability? Where kindness is suicide? Dr. Inger survived. But something inside him didn't. Years later, he played a role in a film called The Killing Fields. He won an Oscar. He told the truth. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, he was murdered in Los Angeles during a robbery. He escaped Cambodia but not the violence. And that is the curse of surviving genocide. You don't escape it. You carry it with you. Forever. You wouldn't hear the screams. Not at first. The Khmer Rouge didn't believe in bullets, too expensive. They killed with shovels, hammers, bamboo sticks. Sometimes with silence. Victims were bound, blindfolded, and marched into fields under the cover of night. Many were made to dig their own graves. Others were executed beside open pits already filled with corpses. Then came the blow. Then the fall. Then the soil. This wasn't war. It was cleansing. Enemies of the revolution weren't just soldiers. They were anyone who remembered a time before. Teachers, musicians, students, monks. Even children of those accused, executed to erase future revenge. It's estimated that nearly 2 million Cambodians died this way, in rice fields turned slaughterhouses, orchards filled with bones, schools turned into torture prisons. One such school still stands. Tul Sleng, also known as S21, was a high school turned hell. Here, over 20,000 people were imprisoned. Only 12 survived. They were chained to metal beds, electrocuted, waterboarded, forced to confess to crimes they never committed. Then, like the others, they were taken to the killing fields. Their photographs remain. Room after room of black and white portraits, faces frozen in fear, confusion, resignation. Children, mothers, old men, each of them labeled, each of them doomed. And yet, the killing wasn't random. It was organized, documented, signed off. This was not chaos. This was a system. A machine built to erase a people, efficiently, quietly, methodically. Cambodians were taught not to ask questions, not to trust, not to remember. Even crying was risky. If you cried, you might be next. If you didn't, you survived. This is the twisted logic of totalitarian purity. To create a perfect world, you must first destroy the human one. That's what the Khmer Rouge believed. But the killing fields didn't purify anything. They desecrated the soul of a nation. Today, if you walk those fields, you'll still see bones rise after the rain. Bits of cloth flutter in the dirt. The dead don't scream anymore. But the earth remembers. By 1979, the silence was deafening. But the borders had begun to shake. Vietnam, once an ally of the Khmer Rouge, had seen enough. Tensions between the two communist nations erupted into war. The Vietnamese army invaded Cambodia, and in just 2 weeks, they took Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge fled into the jungles, dragging their ideology and their nightmares with them. But justice did not come with liberation. Pol Pot, the architect of the genocide, was never tried. He lived in the shadows of the forests for decades, protected by loyalists, issuing orders, pretending to lead a revolution that had already killed itself. He died in 1998, in a hut, in the dark, unrepentant. Not in handcuffs. Not in court. Just gone. And yet, his ghost still lingers. Because what he destroyed can't be rebuilt with laws. The genocide didn't just kill people. It killed trust. It killed memory. It rewired a culture to be afraid of its own reflection. Even after Vietnam installed a new government and Norodom Sihanouk returned as king, the wounds didn't heal. How could they? The country was littered with mass graves. Survivors walked among the dead, unsure who they could love or hate or forgive. Children raised by the regime had never known a mother's voice. Monks returned to temples where all the scriptures had been burned. And for years the world said almost nothing. Cambodia wasn't a geopolitical priority anymore. Western powers looked away. It took decades before the Khmer Rouge leaders were even put on trial. By then most were elderly. Some died before sentencing. Others feigned memory loss. But survivors did not forget. They built museums out of prisons, memorials out of bone fields. They taught their children to remember, not with vengeance but with vigilance. Because forgetting is how it began, and silence is how it spread. Today the ghosts of the killing fields don't scream, but they still speak, through the cracked skulls beneath the grass, through the photographs on blood-stained walls, through the voices of those who dared to survive. They speak to warn us that evil doesn't always arrive with gunfire. Sometimes it comes with promises, with uniforms, with a smile. And when it does, we must remember what happened here, or will happen again. History doesn't repeat itself, but it whispers, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to forget. If this story made you think, feel, or question, then like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more forbidden chapters they never taught you in school. Because the past isn't dead, it's just buried, and we're here to dig it up.